Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, as we are now slowly approaching September, it feels like it's probably the right time to talk about Season 1 for Diablo 4 with a lot of hindsight. Essentially, we're going to dissect the season as it happened, what it gave us, what it promised, the hiccups along the way, the slight recoveries, and quite simply ask the question, how long is left on the life of this season? Well, before we even get into the season itself, we definitely need to talk about the patch that led into it, 1.1. This is quite possibly the most community backlash towards a patch that I have ever seen in my life in a video game that I played personally, and it was all just such a mess. After working to get player confidence back for weeks, including a patch that was exclusively buffs just to make us happy, right before the season they've been hyping us all up for to get to try out, a patch drops with barely no forewarning of what was going to be inside of it, and it was just nerfs. So many nerfs to everyone. Different classes were hit different amounts, of course, but everyone on the whole was nerfed a fair bit. It was just such an out of left field decision in the eyes of most players, and just sort of felt weird to play the game afterwards. A really difficult thing to get away with as a developer in game design is to give players a certain feel of power and then take it away from them. It always results in player annoyance, and while usually this is localized to smaller nerfs at a time, this time they nerfed every character in the game, and the result was everybody was annoyed. It wasn't like, oh, this is annoying, I need to swap builds now to feel as powerful as before. It was, oh, everything feels like this now? What? Why has this only happened now? This feels like something that should have happened before launch. Are we beta testing the game? And that right there immediately made a bunch of people drop off before Season 1 even got a chance to begin. Now it came up in later developer streams that they were planning those nerfs to hit simultaneously with an internal nerf to Nightmare Dungeons at higher tiers in an effort to make high tier Nightmare Dungeons feel exactly the same as they were before stats were dropped, but just give more challenge to the rest of the game around it. And that was just such an odd change. Even if they were going to do that, why release those at separate times? They also nerfed XP gain from monsters higher level than you, which was also such a weird choice. There was very little positive in patch 1.1, even knowing that some of those changes were disconnected, because disconnecting those changes is still really hard to forgive, honestly. Sorcerer nerfs were supposed to come at the same time as Sorcerer buffs, but they didn't. So for the first 3 weeks of the season, Sorcerer was just a beaten up, haggard version of its former self, which was already a rough experience even before the patch. So why did the nerfs even happen when they did? Why not release the nerfs when you're also going to be releasing the buffs and just even it out? Pushing the buffs back just makes it feel bad for the meantime, and if they ever release another patch like 1.1 again, it might well kill the game entirely, which would be a massive shame. So right into it, we have to understand that at the start of the season, the player base was very much not in the most forgiving mood. Those of us that did still play the season anyways found that it was, well, fun. The thing is, even with the shifts to things, Diablo 4 is still Diablo 4 at its core with that addicting, enjoyable gameplay loop. Malignant tunnels were a cool new mechanic when they mattered, which they started to do much less the more that you played, unfortunately. The season questline was actually pretty enjoyable. I don't think any of us expected it to work quite the way that it did, being gated behind season journey chapters. I think it definitely would be better not to do that in the future personally. They said they weren't trying to make this feel like another campaign, but given I was completing it into the level 40s, it definitely did feel at least a bit like one. Not to mention forcing interaction with the season journey. Not that the season journey is something that we wouldn't interact with otherwise, but it's just a really weird combination to me, I guess. The idea is to block off Varshan as a boss until you hit a certain level, probably, but there are ways to do that feel less disconnected than this does, I feel like. Outside of that though, Varshan himself as a boss is a great fight, interesting mechanics, fun to take part in, and it doesn't even feel bad to do on repeat, which by the way is something a lot of people have done, because early on before it was fixed, you could farm the boss for Wrathful Hearts in the story version. Later on, you can farm it for item power 800 guaranteed items in World Tier 4, and this one is an intended interaction, and I quite like this conceptually. They made harder versions of the boss, and then they made the harder version give you reasonable rewards for the difficulty, and it's the only place in the game that you can guaranteed farm high level item power gear, which I do actually think is a fun thing to have inside of this game, and it incentivizes doing different activities from time to time, which this definitely succeeded at doing in my eyes. I still think the best thing that they could have done with this whole thing is have Malignant tunnels in the Nightmare Dungeon system for Season 1, with increased difficulty versions of Varshan at the end of them as a forced fight. Malignant hearts that drop from the Nightmare tunnels should be higher power than they can be found anywhere else in the game as well. That seems like such a simple, of course, sort of moment to me that would tie the whole season together and make it so much more interesting in the later stages, and I'm amazed that they didn't have that thought too. Then we have the Malignant hearts themselves. 32 Malignant hearts, only 16 usable by each class though, as the rest of them are class specific to the other classes. Of all 32 though, there are maybe 2 or 3 that help create new builds or playstyles. The rest of them either are just augmenting existing top builds or are simple statistical things that don't really direct you in too specific a way, and that is actually disappointing to me. I think a lot of Malignant hearts are fun. I think the amount of power they provide is enjoyable to play with, but I think in an ideal world, Malignant Hearts would create at least 2 new viable builds per class that would only exist within that season because they only make sense with the Malignant Hearts, you know? Then the final thing, I suppose, is the 7 new legendaries and 6 new uniques, of which, as far as I'm aware, the only ones in active use and functional builds are the new Druid legendary that makes Poison Creeper fire off landslides and increases earth skill damage to poisoned enemies, and the Necromancer unique shield that gives you extra Bone Storms, as Bone Storm is extremely powerful, so, you know, multiple of them is pretty nice to have. Other than that, they are all just really unusual items that may have some use while leveling and just messing around with, but just as soon as you start putting together proper endgame builds, they get left by the wayside. That said, that does make 2 successes at least, so it isn't a complete waste, but in future they need to make new legendaries and uniques actually feel more aware of the way that the class already works. The reason that the Druid legendary works is because we already have interactions between earth and poison damage, so it just uses that to create something cohesive and new. Work off of that, think about the synergies and built to the classes already that haven't been explored enough with the legendaries and uniques we already have, and then find something that can tie them together. On the whole, most of them have wound up unused, but 2 of them at least shows a slight glimmer of hope for future additions to the game, that they do have a sort of formula that they can look at and say, these are the ones that worked, let's do that again all around. All in all then, what does this mean? Was Season 1 a success? Well, compared to any previous Diablo game seasons, there was actually more here than any of those. They've specifically claimed the season was going to be lighter on content than future seasons as well, and the timing of it being only a month and a half after the game released when the season started needs consideration too. I have had a number of suggestions for how to make this season significantly better from the bones that it has, at least in my opinion, but the reason those suggestions feel so easy for me, so obvious almost, is because the season was relatively successful once you get past the disaster of the 1.1 patch. The bones of the season are strong. It created pockets of fresh gameplay, it added in new activities with 6 different locations, a bit of story to try and get you hooked, some new mechanics, and they even recently reduced the respawn time on Malignant Elites, which is one of my biggest gripes with the season. I think with everything considered, the season is a slight success. One that could have been much worse, but also could have been a lot better. Either if they just put a bit more time into making endgame activities relevant to the season mechanics as well, or if they just didn't do what patch 1.1 did to the game and instead did something like nerf the Barber before we'd ever seen it so that our old stats wouldn't have gone crazy with it. I think this season has strong bones. The execution was definitely far from perfect, but the bones are there, and that's why I'd label it a slight success, because it is Season 1. I will not be this lenient towards Season 2 by any means. If they release a nerf patch 3 weeks before the buff patch that was intended to accompany it ever again, they've lost me. But I personally am happy to label that as just an incredibly rough patch of the game that is possible to overcome with diligent and consistent work on making the game as a whole feel better to play for us. All that said, we are more than a third of the way through this season now, and a lot of people are quitting. They're stopping, they're moving to other games as they release, or just getting too tired of Diablo to keep going and stopping completely. And, well, there's nothing wrong with that. The whole sort of idea of the season system is to draw you in for a bit, get you to remember that addictive feeling and enjoy it for a couple of weeks, a month, 2 months if you're really into it. Then, you just take a break, do some other stuff, and come back into the next season fresh. They don't necessarily want you playing 24/7 so much as they want you to come back time after time after time, every season release, every single year. A big question that I do still see asked is, what if they did more balance changes? Would that bring people back? And yeah, I mean, that would get some people back to mess around with the stuff that they've changed, but unless they make genuine, significant class changes, simple statistic buffs to things just aren't going to bring people back in. Buffs are important, and honestly, this time period here in the middle of the season is the best time for the developers to try out new stuff so they can get it all nailed down before the start of the next season, and that is in fact something that I would start to expect from them from future client patches in Season 1. On the whole, personally, I liked Season 1. Patch 1.1 was trash, absolute hot garbage, but the season that followed it has been genuinely enjoyable on its own. They've done some further patches that have done nothing but good so far, and the game is feeling enjoyable to play. However, while Season 1 did add a number of mechanics that are interesting to engage with, they just sort of fall off hard in the endgame because there's no part of them that is actually relevant once you get there. Meaning once you reach the endgame portion, it's exactly the same as the base game felt, and so a lot of people who were burnt out on playing base Diablo 4 just got back to that point of doing the exact same stuff and went, no man, I don't think I'm doing that again so soon. People are quitting, but I don't think it's a direct indicator of a failure of a season so much as the incoming early end of the season. Season 1 wasn't made to keep your attention the whole way, it was meant as a teaser, an introduction to the season system, and a way to at least shake things up a little bit while we wait for the first proper season to hit in October. Has it succeeded at those things? Yeah. And so while in a vacuum of thinking of nothing else, it can feel like this season was underwhelming, like it was a disappointment, patch 1.1 ruined the whole thing, and yes, there are definitely things that could have been notably better, better, don't get me wrong. It was still, though, actually a really solid season by Diablo standards, and I really hope that standard increases significantly in the future with Season 2, where again, I will not be being as lenient. And that'll do it for today, everyone. Just sort of a roundup dissection of what Season 1 was all about for Diablo 4. Did it work? What could have been better? What does it mean for future seasons? And what it means that player interest is starting to die down. I hope you've enjoyed this sort of discussion-y breakdown type thing, and if you are still playing Diablo 4, I hope you keep finding enjoyment in it. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.